Some girls are born into fairy tales. They grow up with soft beds, warm hands reaching for them in the dark, and mothers who whisper, "I love you," like it costs nothing. Ava Hendricks was not one of those girls. She grew up learning a different kind of lesson, one that no child should ever have to learn, one that pressed itself into her bones before she was old enough to understand why the world felt so sharp against her skin. Silence. Silence was her first teacher, her oldest friend, her only shield. Because when people believe you cannot hear, they stop being careful. They stop being kind. They say things they would never dare to say to someone they believed was listening. And Ava heard every single word, every hushed insult traded between neighbors over back fences, every slurred confession her mother muttered into the bottom of a bottle, every cruel nickname the village children carved into the air around her like it was sport. The deaf girl. That was all she was to them. Not a daughter, not a person, not a soul with fears and dreams and a heartbeat that ached for something real. Just the deaf girl. And for years she let them believe it, because silence had kept her safe when nothing else could. But silence has a cost, and the morning the Alpha King's enforcers arrived in her village to collect unpaid debts, Ava would discover that some prices are far too heavy, and some secrets far too powerful, to carry alone forever. This is the story of the girl sold for 1 silver coin, and the king who discovered she was worth far more than the world had ever bothered to count. For Chapter 1. The day Silence was sold. The rain came down in cold, punishing sheets the morning everything changed. It was the kind of rain that didn't fall so much as press, driving itself into the cobblestones of Ashford Market like it had a grudge against the earth. Vendors pulled their awnings low, children ran for doorways. The grey sky stretched across the valley like a bruise that refused to heal. Ava stood at the edge of the marketplace with a basket of unwashed linens balanced against her hip and mud climbing the hem of her dress, watching the crowd shift and tighten the way crowds do when something dangerous is approaching. She heard them before she saw them. 3 horses, iron-shod hooves striking wet stone in a measured, unhurried rhythm, or the sound of men who knew they didn't need to hurry because no one in this village would dare make them. She kept her eyes down, her face still, her breath slow and even. That was the thing about being believed deaf. People forgot to watch your face for reaction. They forgot to check your shoulders for tension. They only ever watched your ears. And since Ava had never once turned her head at a sound in public, not in years, not since she was 9 years old and first understood what her silence brought her, they had long ago decided she was simply broken. Broken things didn't need to be spoken to carefully. Broken things were just handled. The horses stopped at the center of the square. Ava lifted her eyes slowly, the way she always did. Late. Just a half-breath behind everyone else. Oh, she had practiced that timing so many times, it had become instinct. Look up when others look up, but always one beat after, like a person who felt the shift in the crowd's energy through their feet rather than their ears. 3 men dismounted. The first was Bruce Lambert, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw like a stone ledge and eyes that moved over the crowd the way a butcher's eyes move over livestock. He carried a leather ledger under one arm and wore the black and silver crest of the Alpha King's house on his chest like armor. The second was Hayden Mills, younger, sharper-featured, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of stillness that suggested he had been trained not to fidget. He stood slightly behind Bruce, his hand resting near the hilt at his belt without actually touching it. The posture of a man who wanted you to know force was available without needing to use it. The third was Reginald Finch, and Reginald Finch was the one people feared most, not because he was the largest or the loudest, but because he never smiled. Even now, standing in the cold rain with water running off the brim of his hat. His expression was perfectly, unsettlingly flat. "Debt collection," Bruce Lambert announced to no one and everyone. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't require volume. "By order of Alpha King Darian of the Northern Throne, all outstanding accounts are to be settled today. Property, labor, goods, any arrangement the debtor chooses, so long as the debt is cleared." The crowd rippled with anxiety. Ava watched from beneath her lashes. She already knew her mother was on that list, and Lydia Hendricks had been drinking herself into debt for 3 years. First, it was grain she couldn't pay for. Then, a broken window replaced on credit. Then the healer's fees from the winter Ava had gotten sick, though Lydia had told that story differently to every neighbor, depending on how much sympathy she needed. Ava had heard those stories too, all of them. She had heard the real version the night Lydia came home and told the wall, because she thought Ava was asleep, and deaf besides, that she'd borrowed silver she had no intention of repaying, because what were they going to do? Come out here for one woman's debt? They had come. The cottage door opened. Lydia Hendricks appeared in the doorway of her own home, like a woman who had rehearsed some version of this moment and still wasn't ready for it. She was wearing her better dress, the dark blue one with the fraying at the cuffs, and her hair had been roughly pinned, but her eyes were already glassy at this hour, and the slight sway in her stance was something no amount of better dresses could hide. Ava's chest pulled tight, not with surprise. She had stopped being surprised by her mother a long time ago. With grief, maybe. With something older and more tired than grief. "Lydia Hendricks," Reginald Finch said, consulting the ledger Bruce Lambert opened for him. "Outstanding debt of 14 silver, due since the spring harvest." Lydia stepped forward, and Ava could see her working her jaw the way she did when she was calculating. Not whether to pay, but what to offer instead. "I don't have the coin," Lydia said. Her voice was practiced in its steadiness. "But I have something worth more." She turned, and her eyes found Ava at the edge of the crowd. The basket slipped slightly in Ava's hands. She caught it, kept her face still, kept her eyes just a degree past focused, that particular emptiness she had learned to wear like a mask, the expression of a girl who was present, but not quite there. "My daughter," Lydia said, and her voice didn't crack. That was the part that would stay with Ava longest, that her mother's voice didn't crack. She's deaf, has been since she was small, can't speak, can't hear, but she's strong. She works hard, and she won't give you any trouble. She paused. She's worth more than 14 silver. Easily. The marketplace went very, very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people minding their business. The airless, locked-up quiet of people witnessing something they didn't want to witness but couldn't look away from. Ava stood still. "Don't react. Don't move. Don't let them see." Inside, something that had been quietly cracking for years finished breaking. She felt it go, a clean, cold snap somewhere in the center of her chest, like ice giving way underfoot. The last thread of something she had no name for, something that might once have been called hope. Her mother was selling her. For 14 silver of debt, in the rain, in front of everyone. Reginald Finch looked at Ava with the careful, measuring gaze of a man whose job required him to assess the value of things. He stepped forward, and Ava kept her eyes just slightly unfocused, her chin at a neutral angle. Her hands loose on the basket, despite the fact that her knuckles wanted very badly to go white. "How old?" Finch asked Lydia. 19. Healthy. Strong as an ox. Lydia almost smiled. Never complains. Never talks back. Perfect servant. Perfect servant. Ava had heard those words before, in different shapes. Useful when her mother needed her. Useless when she didn't. Quiet as a compliment, and broken as an insult, sometimes in the same breath, sometimes from the same mouth. She had learned not to let them land. She was still learning. Finch glanced back at his companions. Some silent conversation moved between the three men, the kind that lived in the fraction of a second between a glance and a look away. Then, a sound. Behind Finch, Hayden Mills shifted his weight, and a coin slipped from his belt pouch, striking the cobblestones with a small silver ring. It was nothing. An accident. A tiny sound swallowed almost immediately by the hiss of rain. But Ava's eyes moved, just barely. Just a fraction. An involuntary flicker of her gaze toward the sound, the kind that happens before the thinking mind catches up to the instinctive one. A flinch at nothing. A reaction no truly deaf girl should have had. It lasted less than a second. She corrected immediately, pulling her gaze back to middle distance, smoothing her expression into stillness. But someone had seen it. Not Finch. Not Bruce Lambert. Not her mother. Someone standing further back, still mounted, in the shadow of the nearest building's overhang. A figure she had barely registered, assuming him to be another guard, another enforcer, or someone secondary to the three men doing the actual work. He was not secondary. He was never secondary. Alpha King Darien had not announced himself, and no one had said his name, and yet the shape of him, the absolute, deliberate stillness of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any room, had been there from the beginning. Ava did not look at him directly, but she felt his gaze find her. And stay. Finch turned back to Lydia. The debt is 14 silver. The girl's labor value over 1 year would satisfy that. Lydia's expression shifted, calculating again. She'd need to be returned after... She would not be returned, Finch said flatly. Labor contract for full debt clearance. Standard terms. Lydia opened her mouth, closed it, did the arithmetic behind her eyes. Fine, she said. Not I'm sorry, Ava. Or not I have no choice. Not even a glance that carried any weight of love or guilt or the ghost of either. Just fine. And then Darien spoke for the first time. His voice was low, not raised to carry. It simply did, the way deep water carries sound further than shallow water understands. 1 coin, he said. Every head turned. He walked his horse forward slowly, emerging from the shadow of the overhang, and the crowd did something Ava had never seen a crowd do before. It didn't part out of politeness. It receded, people stepping back the way water steps back from a stone, dropped in a still pool, instinctive and immediate. He was tall in the saddle, in a way that had nothing to do with height, and everything to do with presence. Dark coat. No crest displayed, but none needed. Rain running off his shoulders like it didn't dare cling. Or a face that was striking, not because of softness, but because of the precise, unhurried quality of his attention. The way his gaze moved over things like he was reading them, cataloguing them, deciding their worth in a language no one else spoke fluently. He reached into his coat, produced a single silver coin, held it out toward Finch without looking at him. 1 coin for the girl. Debt of 14 is absorbed by the crown. Consider it a rounding error. Finch took the coin without comment. Darien's eyes moved to Ava. She kept her face still. He kept looking. This one, he said quietly. Not to Finch, not to Lydia, not to the crowd, almost to himself. I'll take the silent girl. Lydia Hendricks said nothing. The crowd said nothing. The rain said everything. Ava set her basket down on the cobblestones carefully, but because there was nothing else to do, and because she would not give this moment the gift of watching her hands shake. She straightened. She did not look at her mother. She had said goodbye to Lydia Hendricks long before this morning. She had just never known the date until now. As she walked toward the King's Horse, the mud of Ashford Market clinging to the hem of her dress, she heard Hayden Mills murmur to Reginald Finch, just quietly enough that most people wouldn't have caught it. What does the king want with a deaf girl? And Finch's answer, even quieter, nothing useful. Ava kept walking. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. And somewhere behind the careful stillness of her face, she was already asking herself the question that would keep her awake for many nights to come. What had the king actually seen? Chapter 2. The king who prefers quiet. The castle did not welcome Ava. It received her the way an ocean receives a stone, without comment, without ceremony, closing around her as though she had simply always been sinking. Thornwall Keep rose from the northern ridge of the valley like something that had grown from the rock rather than been built upon it. Black stone, high walls, narrow windows that caught light reluctantly and kept it brief. The kind of structure that communicated, without needing to say a word, that softness was not practiced here. She was handed off at the gate to a woman named Mabel Doolin, a castle servant of middle years with quick, assessing eyes, and the clipped efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped wasting warmth on people who might not stay. But Mabel looked her over, the way a seamstress looks at fabric of uncertain quality. "Deaf," she said, to herself more than to Ava, consulting a small slip of paper she'd been given. "Private wing assignment." She folded the paper, tucked it away. Ava kept her face neutral and waited. "Follow close," Mabel said, using the brisk hand signal that people defaulted to when they assumed deafness. "Come," and turned without waiting for acknowledgement. Ava followed. The castle interior was all stone corridors and candlelight that did more to suggest warmth than provide it. They passed the main servant halls and through a heavy iron door and up a stairway that spiraled tight and steep, and then through another door that opened onto a quieter passage, wider, what with better stonework and candles in proper iron brackets instead of cheap tallow stubs jammed into wall sconces. The private wing. 2 women were scrubbing the hallway floor when Ava and Mabel passed. They looked up, and Ava caught the quick exchange of glances between them. The kind that passed information without words. New girl. Private wing. Already? One of the women, young, dark-haired, with the kind of pretty face that made her wariness more striking, leaned toward the other and murmured just low enough to be polite, but not low enough to matter, because everyone knew the deaf girl couldn't hear. "No one stays in the private wing long," the dark-haired one said. Her name, Ava would learn later, was Kerry Hampton. The king doesn't like noise, doesn't like company. And the last servant assigned up here lasted 4 days before he had her reassigned to the laundry for breathing too loud near his study. The other woman, Pamela Mackenzie, older, with tired eyes and the careful posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 4 days was optimistic. Don't let the girl get comfortable. Mabel said nothing to this, just kept walking. Ava kept her eyes ahead. 4 days, she thought. Then I'll find a way out. She was given a small room at the end of the private wing's corridor. Not a closet, not the bare stone shelf she had half expected, but a genuine room with a narrow bed, a chest for belongings, a single window that looked out over the back courtyard. By the standards of every place she had ever slept, it was extraordinary. She stood in the center of it for a moment, after Mabel left, just breathing. Then she turned in a slow circle, cataloguing the exits. Door, window, 2nd floor, courtyard below, possible in an emergency, but not quietly. The room's walls were thick stone. Sound travelled strangely in thick stone buildings. Sometimes it swallowed everything. Sometimes it carried a whisper 3 corridors. She would learn the patterns. She always learned the patterns. The first 3 days, Ava was given simple tasks by Mabel. Linens to be sorted, floors in the outer corridors to be swept, fireplaces to be laid in the morning before the wing woke. Work that kept her visible, but peripheral. Work designed, she suspected, to allow the king to observe her without either of them acknowledging the observation, because he watched her, not constantly, or not obviously. But she felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather shifts, a particular quality of attention that was unlike the absent, habitual monitoring of people who supervised servants. This was something else. On the fourth evening, it became something concrete. She was carrying a tray of documents from the outer study, heavy rolls of parchment, sealed letters, a leather-bound ledger, when she heard footsteps behind her. Not the quick, purposeful walk of a servant. Slower, deliberate. She kept walking at her same pace. The footsteps stopped, or a voice, low and unhurried. "Leave those on the strategy table inside. The door is open." She counted 3 full seconds before reacting. The safe delay, of the deaf girl's delay, then turned toward the open study door, as if she had felt the instruction through the vibration of the floor, or simply understood her job through context. Inside the study, she set the documents where indicated and turned to leave. He was in the doorway, not blocking it. Just there. In the way tall, quiet men sometimes simply occupied a space, not by filling it aggressively, but by making everything else in it seem like it was arranged around him. Darian in the daylight was different from Darian on horseback in the rain. He was dressed plainly. No ceremony, no armor, a dark shirt unlaced slightly at the collar and trousers that suggested function over royalty. His face was sharper up close. The jaw, the set of his mouth, for the eyes, dark and very steady, and currently doing the same cataloguing thing she'd felt from across the marketplace 3 days ago. He stepped aside to let her pass. She moved through the doorway, keeping her breathing even. Just before she cleared the frame, he signed, deliberately, slowly, using the formal hand language of the Northern Territories. "Come back in an hour. There are more papers." She took the full 3 seconds, then gave a small, obedient nod and walked away down the corridor without looking back. She heard him exhale. It was not a sound of frustration. It was something more considered than that. Interesting, the sound said, though it used no words. She did not let herself think about what it meant. Not yet. That hour passed, then the next, and by the time the castle's lower bells had marked the 9th hour of the evening, Ava had learned the following things about Alpha King Darian of the Northern Throne. He did not eat with his court. He took meals in the private study, or not at all, and the kitchen staff had long since stopped predicting which. He read constantly, not ceremonially, but the way people read when it is as necessary as breathing, reaching for parchment the way others reach for water. He spoke rarely in the corridor, and when he did speak, it was in complete thoughts, with no wasted words, as if speech was a resource he managed carefully. He also, she noticed, had a habit of going very still when he was thinking. Not the stillness of rest or inattention, but the stillness of absolute, concentrated presence. A predator's stillness, as a stillness that meant, I am calculating something, and I am very good at it. It made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, which was a problem she filed away to worry about later. On the 5th day, something shifted. She was in the study, building the morning fire, when Darian came in with Reginald Finch. They were mid-conversation, and neither slowed nor lowered their voices, because she was the deaf girl, and the deaf girl was furniture. The Cantrell faction has moved more men into the eastern corridor, Finch said, spreading a map across the strategy table with the brisk efficiency of a man presenting evidence. Wesley Cantrell has been meeting with the Lambert traders twice a week. We think they're moving silver, not goods. Moving silver where? North, or toward the Brock holdings. Ava kept her eyes on the fire she was building, kept her hands steady. She heard every word. She also heard what neither of them said, that silver moving north toward the Brock holdings meant someone was funding something. Soldiers, maybe, or loyalty. Both, possibly. And the Haskins girl? Darian asked. Winnie Haskins is still at her father's estate. Whether she's involved or simply present, we can't confirm. Darian was quiet for a moment, long enough that Finch shifted slightly on his feet. Keep watching, Darian said finally. Don't move yet. Finch rolled the map. The girl, he said, with a nod in Ava's direction. Not at her, just toward her general location, the way you'd nod toward a piece of furniture you were working around. She's been in the private wing 5 days now. Oh, the staff is talking. Let them. Some of them are concerned about sensitive. She's deaf, Finch. A pause. Yes, my lord. They left. Ava fed the last log into the fire, and the flames took it with a soft, steady exhale, and she sat back on her heels and stared into the orange light and thought about silver moving north toward the Brock holdings. She thought about Wesley Cantrell and the Lambert traders. She thought about a king who kept her close and called her furniture. And she thought about the coin that had dropped on the cobblestones of Ashford Market, and the fraction of a second in which her eyes had moved, and the question she had been asking herself ever since. What had he actually seen? The fire crackled. She had no answer yet, but she was beginning to suspect it was more than she wanted to know. Now, Chapter 3. The observation game. He started testing her on the 6th day. It was subtle at first, the kind of subtle that only meant anything if you were paying attention, which Ava always was. A book dropped in the corridor behind her, the natural, startling crack of heavy binding against stone. She kept walking, didn't turn, counted the right number of steps before she slowed, not at the sound, but at the slight change in air pressure from the open study door ahead, the way a person who navigated by feel and sight rather than hearing might reasonably pause. She heard him make a small note of something, pen against parchment. 3 hours later, a sealed envelope placed on the edge of a table she was cleaning, placed with more force than necessary. A sharp sound, close range. She continued wiping the table, then moved the envelope as if clearing her path. Didn't look toward the sound of its placement. Pen against parchment again. The following morning, she was moving down the outer corridor with fresh candles when she heard his voice, low, from around the corner ahead, clearly not meant to carry, saying her name. Ava. Not loudly, not sharply. Just her name, in the cadence of a man testing the edge of a blade. She walked around the corner and almost into him, startling back with the appropriate reaction of someone who had not heard him, but had simply been surprised by his sudden proximity. His eyes were unreadable. Careful, he said, signing the word alongside speaking it. The slow, careful sign of someone who had recently learned it. She nodded, moved past. Behind her, no pen, no parchment, just silence. But a different kind of silence than before. The tests continued. A coin dropped, always at the limit of range, always from behind. A whispered word. A chair scraped deliberately against stone. A shutter knocked loose so it banged in the wind at intervals, measurable, predictable, to see if she grew accustomed to its rhythm. She passed every test. She never moved at the right moment. Never turned at sounds she should have missed. Calibrated her reactions with the precise, exhausting discipline of someone who had been doing this not for days, but for years. And still. He kept looking at her like a puzzle where the pieces were all present, but the picture hadn't resolved yet. On the 9th night, he taught her sign language. Or rather, he sat across the work table from her in the late evening study and demonstrated signs, and she watched, and mimicked, and let him correct her hands with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who was very good at waiting. It was the closest he had been to her. He reached across the table and lifted her hand, just her fingers, just gently, the contact brief and businesslike, and adjusted the angle of her gesture, reshaping the sign for listen into something more precise. "Like this," he said, and then signed the word himself, and looked at her, and waited for her to try it again. She did. His thumb moved across the back of her hand before he released it. Slow. Almost unconscious. Almost. She focused very hard on the sign she was making, and not on the warmth that had transferred from his fingers to her skin. He signed, "You learn quickly." She gave a small, composed nod. He studied her face for a moment. Then he signed, deliberately, moving each gesture with unusual care. "You are not afraid of me." It was not a question. She met his eyes, held them long enough that it was no longer ambiguous, no longer the automatic gaze of someone processing information. It was something more direct than that, something that said, "I see you looking, and I am not turning away." He went still, not the predator stillness she had catalogued before, something softer at the edges. Surprised, maybe, in the way people who are rarely surprised look surprised, briefly, carefully, before the walls come back up. She dropped her eyes first, but only because she chose to. When he stood to end the session, he paused at the door. He signed, his back half-turned. "Come tomorrow." Same time. She didn't nod this time. She just let the silence answer. And in the privacy of her chest, something small and cautious and entirely unwelcome turned toward him, the way a plant turns toward light. Not because it decided to, but because that was simply what living things did. She should have been more careful. The days that followed had a shape to them that she hadn't anticipated and didn't know what to do with. Morning tasks, afternoon proximity, evening sessions in the study with its low fire and the smell of old parchment and candle wax and something warmer beneath it, something that belonged to him and not the room. He began eating in the study rather than skipping meals entirely, a tray brought by Mabel, left on the side table, eaten without ceremony while he read or worked. Ava would be there, doing something peripheral, and he would occasionally look up and push a portion of the tray in her direction. No sign, or no instruction, just sharing, the way people share who don't want to acknowledge they're doing it. She ate. He pretended not to notice she ate. She pretended not to notice him pretending. It was, she thought, possibly the most honest relationship she had ever had with anyone, which said something about the rest of her life, and none of it was easy. In the evenings, they covered more ground. He taught her signs she hadn't seen before, complex words, not just simple instructions, words like strategy and patience and trust. She wondered if he chose them deliberately. She suspected he did. One evening he placed a sheet of parchment and a clean quill in front of her, and signed, "For your thoughts, if you want." She looked at the parchment. She looked at him. He was already returning to his own papers, casually, or as if the gesture was unremarkable, as if offering a deaf servant girl access to ink and parchment, the materials of communication, of record, of being heard, was simply practical. No one had ever offered her that before. She picked up the quill. She didn't write anything that night. She just held it, and he didn't ask what she was doing, and the fire burned low, and outside the study window the wind moved through the courtyard trees, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ava Hendricks sat in a room with another person, and didn't feel like she needed to be invisible. It frightened her more than anything else in the castle had, because she knew that this was not permanent. She was a purchased servant, a one-coin transaction, a convenience. Whatever this was, this evening study warmth, this careful patience, these lingering corrections of her hands, it was not safety. It was danger wearing a gentler face. She needed to remember that. She was having a very difficult time remembering that. Chapter 4. The Man Behind the Alpha. The castle had rhythms, and Ava learned them all. She learned which floorboards in the corridor announced approach, and which held secrets. She learned that Reginald Finch came to report at the 9th bell, and that the reports were always longer than the official version suggested. She learned that Mabel Doolin kept a small flask behind the linen press. Not from drinking, it turned out, but from an old joint pain she'd had since a fall years ago that the castle healer had never fully sorted. And the flask was something she kept private, with the particular shame of people who'd been told to just be stronger about suffering. She left a bundle of dried willow bark on Mabel's work table one morning without comment. Mabel looked at it, looked at Ava, said nothing. But her jaw had softened, and she never sent Ava to do the worst of the corridor scrubbing again. She learned that Kerry Hampton, the dark-haired woman who'd warned her not to get comfortable, was actually frightened of being relocated to the outer holdings, where her younger brother was indentured, and that this fear made her sharp in the way that fear usually makes people sharp. When Ava started trading small pieces of castle schedule information with her, not dangerous information, just useful information, but the kind that made a servant's day more navigable, Kerry softened too, not friends, not yet, but something adjacent to trust. She learned that the noble visitors who arrived periodically at Thornwall Keep had a predictable anatomy. The Cantrell family's people always arrived with more guards than were necessary, and watched the exits of every room they entered. The Lambert traders said one thing in court and another in corridors. And a woman named Leona Brock, who visited twice in a fortnight with cold, elegant composure and the particular wariness of someone concealing significance, made Darian's jaw set differently than any other visitor. Ava filed everything, and she watched Darian. She watched the way he held court, not distantly, but with the careful attention of someone who was reading subtext and surface simultaneously. She watched how he moved through conflict, never reactive, always 2 steps ahead, ceding ground deliberately when it suited him the way a strategist cedes a pawn to protect a more valuable piece. She watched him with the nobles who tested him. One afternoon, a lord named Wesley Cantrell arrived unannounced, a broad man in his late 40s with the hearty confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged, accompanied by a woman introduced as Simone, his wife, who wore her composure like a weapon and assessed every servant in the room within 30 seconds of entering it. Ava was arranging a fresh set of candles on the side table and did not look up. "Westley," Darian said from behind his desk. Not welcoming, just acknowledgement. "My lord." Cantrell's voice was warm in the way that suggested the warmth was applied, not inherent. "I hope the morning finds you well. I wanted to discuss the spring trade routes before the eastern roads get difficult." "The eastern roads aren't difficult yet. Preparation is always wise." Simone Cantrell had moved to the window and was looking out at the courtyard with exaggerated interest, which meant she was actually watching the study's interior in the glass reflection. Ava took her time with the candles. "Sit," Darian said. Not an invitation, a decision being made about what to allow. Cantrell sat. The conversation that followed was entirely about trade routes, and entirely not about trade routes, and Ava catalogued every layer of it with the quiet attention of someone who had spent her whole life understanding what people meant rather than what they said. Cantrell wanted access to the northern passes, but not for goods, for movement, for the kind of movement that required the king to look away at a specific time, which Cantrell was trying to negotiate without saying so. Darian gave him nothing, did it graciously, sent him away satisfied he'd made progress when he'd made none. After they left, Darian was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Ava. She was still finishing with the candles. He watched her for a count of 3, and she felt it on the back of her neck. Then he said, "To the room," to himself, in the tone of a man who thought he was speaking only to himself. The quiet ones always survive the longest. She did not move, but something inside her chest shifted, a realignment, subtle and irreversible, like a door that has swung just past the point where it would close on its own. He meant it as an observation about strategy. She heard it as something closer to a recognition. That evening, the study session ran later than usual. They had moved past simple signs into something more like conversation, her responding to his questions with combinations of gestures and written words on the parchment he'd given her, him interpreting with the ease of someone who had evidently been studying this more than he let on. He asked her once, through signs, "What do you see when you look at people?" She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, "What they're not saying." He was still for a beat. Then a corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might begin if it decided to proceed. "Sharp," he said softly. Not signing it. Just saying it. She looked at the parchment. He reached past her to indicate a word she'd written, and his arm came close enough that she could feel the warmth of it along her shoulder, and she kept her breathing carefully, even while her pulse did something it had no business doing. "Here," he said. His voice was lower. The candle between them pushed his shadow behind him and the light across his face. He was so close that if she turned her head, they would be looking at each other from almost no distance. She turned her head. They were looking at each other from almost no distance. His eyes moved over her face, unhurried, particular, the way he looked at everything, which made it more affecting rather than less. "If you could speak," he said quietly, "what would you say?" She held his gaze. Her hand moved, just slightly, just the beginning of a sign, the gesture for everything, and then stopped. He watched her hand. He didn't ask again, but the space between them held it, the unfinished gesture, the almost answer, the way a room holds a note after the instrument goes silent. He stood slowly, moved to the window. She breathed. "Same time tomorrow," he said. She left the study with the quill still warm in her hand, and the feeling that she had just survived something without quite knowing what it was. Chapter 5. The truth. He already knew, she found out on a Tuesday. Not from him. From a conversation he had with Reginald Finch that she was not supposed to be able to hear, standing outside the study door with a stack of clean linens, waiting to be signed in. "She's been here 3 weeks, Finch said. His voice had the particular tight quality it got when he was addressing something he considered to be an avoidable problem. "The staff is settled, or the court gossips, but nothing that creates concern. However," a pause, the sound of parchment, "I want to raise the original reason for her acquisition." "Raise it then," Darian said. "You noticed her react to the coin, at the marketplace. You believe she hears?" A pause that had a specific weight to it. "I know she hears," Darian said. Ava went very still in the corridor. "You've confirmed it?" "I've tested it consistently for 3 weeks. The reactions are too calibrated to be coincidental. She's not deaf, Finch. She's very, very good at appearing deaf." Finch made a sound. "Then why hasn't she been—" "Because," Darian said, and his voice was measured, deliberate, the tone he used when he was saying something he had thought through to its end. "She is not a threat. She is a person who learned to survive in the only way available to her, and that is a specific kind of intelligence I am not interested in punishing." Silence in the study. "She hears everything we discuss in that room," Finch said. His voice was not accusing, just stating. "Yes." "And that concerns you?" "It would concern me if I didn't trust her judgment more than most people in this castle who can speak freely." A pause. She hasn't repeated a word. She hasn't leveraged a single piece of information. She has had Finch. She has had opportunities. She could have gone to the Cantrells. She could have gone to half a dozen people who would have paid well for what she knows. She has not. Finch was quiet. She's been here 3 weeks, Darian said again. And I trust her more than I trust most of my council. Or draw your own conclusions. The linens in Ava's arms felt very heavy. She stood in the corridor for a long moment, with her breath held and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and her entire carefully constructed world rearranging itself around a single axis. He knew. He had always known. He had not exposed her, had not used it against her, had not sent her away or had her punished or sold her again to someone worse. He had watched over the secret, kept it for her, the way you keep something you value. The feeling that moved through her chest then was nothing she had a name for. It was too large for gratitude, too careful for hope, too warm for anything she had been allowing herself to feel. She was going to leave, she decided, that evening, before it got worse. And she had been planning a quiet departure for several days, just disappearing, the way she'd survived before, by simply being no longer present in a place that wanted to own her. She knew the castle's rhythms. She knew the guard rotation. She knew which gate was understaffed on the 3rd night watch. She would go. She would find somewhere small. She would be silent again. And safe. The plan made perfect logical sense. She carried it, and the linens, and her rapidly fragmenting composure, into the study. That night brought a storm. Not the cold, steady rain of the marketplace. A real storm, with lightning that turned the courtyard white every few seconds, and thunder that arrived not as a single crack, but as a rolling architectural sound that moved through the castle walls themselves. Ava was in the study. There had been no session planned, but the lamp in the study was lit, and she had come to finish copying a document that Mabel had said needed to be done before morning. And she had. She could admit this to herself, here, in the dark of her own thoughts. She had wanted to be in the room one more time before she left. She was sitting at the work table when he came in, not expecting her. He stopped briefly when he saw her, and she gave the appropriate delayed response, turning at the draft from the open door rather than his footfall, rising to her feet. He waved her back down, sat in his usual chair, picked up a document. The storm moved through. Lightning, the rolling thunder, the hiss of rain against the narrow window. Ava was finishing her copy when the floor tilted under her. Not literally, but the stack of parchments on the edge of the table shifted in a draft from the loose-fitting window, and she reached for them, and her foot caught the leg of her stool, and she went sideways. He moved faster than she expected from a man sitting in a chair. His arm caught her waist, solid, instinctive, pulling her upright before she completed the fall, so that she ended pressed briefly against his side, with his hand flat against the curve of her waist, and her hands caught against his chest. The contact lasted only a second, but it lasted. She looked up. He was looking down. Lightning lit the window white. His hand at her waist didn't move immediately. His face was very close. The study smelled of candle wax and old paper and rain, and beneath all of it, something warmer, something that lived in the specific space between them, like something that had been building for 3 weeks in evening sessions and shared silences, and hands adjusted over sign language, and a quill offered without expectation. His voice, when he spoke, was low, quiet, careful. You hear more than you show. He didn't phrase it as a question. Don't you? The air stopped. She looked at him. She did not sign, did not write, did not give the delayed response. Just looked at him, for one honest, unguarded second, with nothing in her face except the truth. His expression shifted. The walls came partway down, and what was underneath them was not anger, not triumph, not the satisfaction of someone who had solved a puzzle at another's expense. It was something that looked almost like relief. He let her go, slowly, deliberately, like a choice being made in real time. She stepped back, but he turned to the window. "You should probably go to sleep," he said. His voice was steady, controlled. A man managing something carefully. "The morning will come early." She stood there for a moment. Then she gathered her parchments and her quill and the shreds of the plan she'd been building and walked to the door. She did not leave the castle that night. She told herself it was because of the storm. She knew it wasn't. Chapter 6. The voice that could destroy her. The Royal Assembly was announced 5 days later. Not a small gathering, a formal court event, the kind that required the full castle to mobilize in preparation. Extra staff brought in from the lower households. The great hall opened and aired, and set with long tables, and the king's standard hung freshly pressed from the upper rafters. Was Ava heard the purpose of it from Finch's report to Darian, which she wasn't supposed to be able to hear. It was a loyalty assembly, not framed that way publicly, framed as a seasonal review of the region's trade agreements. But Darian was taking stock of where his people stood. In the face of rumors about silver moving north and alliances quietly reshaping, he was calling the significant players together to see their faces and read what their faces could not hide. The guests arrived across 2 days. Bruce Lambert, who Ava recognized from the marketplace, arrived with a small entourage and the specific jovial warmth of a man who was either genuinely unconcerned or very accomplished at performing unconcern. Gerald Cantrell, Wesley's brother, older, quieter, though with deep-set eyes and hands that were always slightly too still, arrived separately. A woman named Leona Brock came in the company of a young man introduced as Blaze Hobbs, whom she kept beside her with the protective proximity of someone guarding an asset rather than enjoying company. Simone Cantrell returned, this time without Wesley, which was itself a piece of information. Clara Richmond, a senior member of the court whose opinion carried weight with at least a third of the other nobles, arrived last, and every person in the room recalibrated slightly when she entered, the way rooms do when their most significant observer takes a seat. Ava was assigned to the Great Hall, not a prominent position. She was one of a dozen servants managing the peripheral tasks, the refilled wine, the removed plates, but the replacement of candles burned low. Work designed to keep her present, but invisible. She moved through the hall with the quiet efficiency she had learned over years of being overlooked, and she listened to everything. The conversations at the long tables had the public surface of courtesy and trade discussion, and beneath it, a dozen smaller conversations conducted through tone and implication and the strategic placement of silences. Blaze Hobbs leaned toward Gerald Cantrell during the second course and said something too low for the nearby servants to catch. Cantrell didn't react visibly, but his hand moved beneath the table. Ava was 3 tables away and heard it clearly. After the council turns, Archer will be positioned at the eastern pillar. He won't miss at that range. She kept walking. She set a fresh candle at the table's end, turned back toward the service corridor. Archer. Eastern pillar. After the council turns. The assembly was structured so that, partway through the evening, Darian would turn to the assembled council members seated to his east, formally addressing them by name in the old acknowledgement tradition. It was custom. Everyone knew the moment. Everyone knew when his back would be briefly, fully exposed to the room, including whoever had put an archer at the eastern pillar. Ava moved through the hall. She thought about leaving, finding Finch, finding Mabel, finding anyone who could carry this information forward through proper channels, quietly, without requiring her to speak. But Finch was at the far end of the room in conversation with Bruce Lambert's people, and Mabel wasn't in the hall, and the other servants wouldn't understand what she was conveying without being able to hear her explain it, and the council address was 20 minutes away at most, and there was a man with an arrow at the eastern pillar. She moved to the eastern corridor entrance, casually, deliberately, the way you move when you don't want anyone to notice direction. There was a man behind the second pillar. He had an arrow. Not yet nocked. Not yet ready. Still waiting for the moment. He had not noticed her because she was a quiet servant in the background, and no one ever noticed the quiet servant in the background. She moved back into the main hall. Darian was at the head of the table, speaking to Clara Richmond. His face was composed, his voice unhurried. He had no idea. 20 minutes. 15 now. She looked at the distance between herself and him, the people between them, the angle required to put herself in his sight line without drawing attention from the other guests, the sound her voice would make after years of disuse. Rough, probably. Unpracticed. She had spoken quietly to herself sometimes, in the dark of the room at night, maintaining the mechanism against the day she might need it. But spoken loudly. Spoken across a full hall. If she spoke, her secret died. Everything Darian had said to Finch about her composure, her judgment, her trustworthiness, it would be consumed by the fact that she had deceived everyone for weeks. The court would call her a spy. They would have reason to. She would have no defense that would satisfy a room of people who had been lied to. She watched Darian turn slightly to his left, as engaging another guest. 10 minutes. She thought about her mother's voice. She won't complain. She thought about the coin dropped on cobblestones and the glance she couldn't stop. She thought about parchment and quill offered without expectation. About a hand released slowly, like a choice. About the quiet ones always survive the longest, said to a room that was supposed to be empty of anyone who could understand. She thought about a king who had known her secret for 3 weeks, and had protected it for no other reason than that he thought she deserved protection. 5 minutes. Ava Hendricks drew a breath. She had been silent since she was 9 years old. Not truly silent. She had heard everything. She had thought everything, felt everything, catalogued everything in the enormous, living interior that the world had decided didn't exist because they couldn't access it. She had been unseen. She was so tired of being unseen. The council address began. Darian rose, began to turn east, and Ava opened her mouth. Chapter 7. The first word. Behind you! The sound of her voice filled the great hall, the way a stone fills a still pool. Immediate, total, and with reverberations that continued long after the stone had landed. It was not elegant. It was not composed. It was the sound of a voice that had been contained for years, suddenly released, rough at the edges, carrying all of its long-held pressure with it. But it was loud. Darian turned. Instinct. Faster than thought. The instinct of a man who had survived by listening, even when the voice didn't make sense. The arrow passed through the exact space where his back had been. It struck the tapestry on the far wall and hung there, quivering. The great hall froze. Not in a gradual way. All at once, a collective suspension of breath and motion, every head turning, every body stilling, the way people still when the ground shifts beneath them, and they aren't yet certain in which direction. Then the eruption. Chairs, movement. Darian's guards, Cruz Hobbs and Josiah Finch, were moving through the hall toward the eastern corridor before the tapestry had stopped shaking. The archer tried to run and did not get far. But in the hall, the stillness recongealed almost immediately around a different point of gravity. The deaf girl had spoken. White Ava stood in the middle of the great hall with her arms at her sides, and her breathing ragged and her face entirely, helplessly open. No mask, no delay, no carefully calibrated expression. Just her own face, looking out at the world for the first time in years. The voices started. She spoke. The deaf girl. She can hear. She's been... Simone Cantrell's voice cut through with practiced coldness. She's been spying. She's been here for weeks, in the private wing, listening to everything. Oh, she's a fraud. She should be. Enough. One word. Darian's voice did not rise. It did not need to. It landed like a hand pressing flat against a drum. Instant cessation. He was standing at the head of the table, facing the room. And the room, the entire assembled court, the nobles, the council, and the servants frozen at the edges, turned to him the way they always turned to him. Because this was what he was. This was what he had always been, the thing the room oriented around. He looked at Ava. She looked back. She was trembling slightly. She couldn't stop it, not from fear exactly, but from the release of something held too long under too much pressure. Her hands were cold. Her voice, if she tried to use it again, would likely shake. She didn't drop her eyes. He walked toward her. Each step was deliberate. The hall watched every one of them. He stopped in front of her, close but not crowding her. That careful distance he had always maintained, the one that felt like respect rather than restraint. And he looked at her face with the same quality of attention he had given her from the beginning. Cataloguing. Reading. Deciding. Then he turned to the court. "I paid 1 coin for a servant," he said. His voice was clear, carrying, every word landing with the precision of a man who had thought about this moment, or something like it, and knew what he wanted to say. 1 coin. And tonight, without being asked, without any promise of protection or reward, knowing fully what it would cost her, she gave back the one thing no coin could have purchased. He paused. My life. The hall was silent. You want to call her a fraud? He looked toward Simone Cantrell, toward Gerald Cantrell. His gaze moved across the assembled room with the flat, comprehensive quality of a man taking final inventory. She guarded this court's secrets better than most of its council members have. She used nothing against us. She asked for nothing. She has earned, and by every measure I know how to apply, more trust than half the people in this room who were born to it. Simone Cantrell opened her mouth. I am not finished, Darian said. She closed it. From this moment, he said, she is under my direct protection. Any action taken against her will be treated as an action taken against the throne. Anyone who has a problem with that, I invite you to make it formal. He let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. Tonight, no one made it formal. The hall cleared in the aftermath, guards managing the archers' removal, servants moving in the directed patterns of people who had been well-trained for crisis, the guests dispersing into smaller, quieter clusters that would all be having the same conversation from different angles. Ava was standing near the eastern wall when he came to find her, but he came alone. He stopped a step away, that same careful distance. She looked at him. Her throat was still raw. Her hands had stopped shaking, mostly. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at her, the way he always had. Like she was a thing worth the time it took to read clearly. I was afraid, she said. Her voice sounded strange in her ears. Present, audible, real in the world in a way it hadn't been for a very long time. I know, he said. Not of you. She needed him to understand the distinction. I was afraid of what it would mean to be heard, to have, to be. She stopped. The words were there, but they were new, unfamiliar in her mouth, like a language she'd spoken only inside her own head for years. To be more than a problem someone had to manage. He was quiet for a moment. You were never that, he said. Now you bought me for 1 coin. I bought your safety. His voice was direct, not apologetic. He didn't operate in apology, and she found she didn't want apology from him, not for this. Just truth. The marketplace was not a safe place for someone with your particular skill to remain unaccounted for. I bought you before someone else could. She turned that over. You suspected what I was, she said. From the coin drop. I knew what you were from the coin drop, he said. What I suspected, what took 3 weeks to confirm, was the rest of it. What rest of it? He looked at her steadily. That you were worth more than what the world had decided to do with you, he said. Quiet. Certain. No performance in it. She felt the words land in the space behind her sternum and stay there. She didn't have an answer for that. He stepped closer. There's not much, just enough that the distance between them became something with texture rather than space. Close enough that she would have to make a deliberate choice to step back. She didn't step back. His hand came up slowly, not reaching, just raising, until his fingers brushed her jaw, the faintest contact, barely there. The quill, he said, the parchment, what you wrote. She remembered. What they're not saying. You were writing about me, he said. She didn't deny it. What was I not saying? He asked. His voice had dropped to something quiet and particular, the voice he used when there were no guards and no courts and no performance required. She met his eyes. That you were lonely, she said, that the castle was full of people, and you had no one to be honest with. That you talked to me because I was the only person you were sure wasn't curating what I said based on what you were. Silence. Because you thought I couldn't speak, she added. Because I thought, he said slowly, that you would tell me the truth regardless. Deaf or hearing or anything else. A pause. I was right. The fire in the wall bracket sent light across his face in a way that made him look less like a king and more like a man standing in a room with someone he had been honest with, which might have been the same thing underneath. Ava. Her name in his mouth was careful, like something he'd been holding. She didn't move away. His thumb traced along her jaw. Gentle, unhurried, the same way he'd always touched things he was choosing to be careful with. Stay, he said. Not a command. Not a purchase. A request. Small and real, and entirely without ornament. She breathed in. She thought about Ashford Market, and cold rain and a basket of linen set down on cobblestones. She thought about a room with a narrow window, and the first fire that had been hers, however temporarily. She thought about parchment and quill and for your thoughts. She thought about her voice, rough and present, filling a hall with the first words she'd spoken in years. Not for herself, but for him. And how it hadn't felt like breaking. It had felt like opening. I'm already here, she said. His forehead came down to rest against hers. Slow, deliberate, like a choice being made in real time, breath shared, eyes closed, the hall outside a distant country. Just stillness, just warmth, just 2 people in a room with nothing between them for the first time. Not possession, recognition, the thing that had been building in evening sessions and shared silences and near falls in thunderstorms, finally allowed to be exactly what it was, without the weight of secrets or the armor of performance. She wasn't the deaf girl anymore. She was Ava, and he was Darian. And for now, in the low fire and the quiet aftermath of a night that had changed everything, that was enough. Epilogue. The voice that rebuilt a throne. A year later, Thornwall Keep was different. Not in its stone. The stone was the same, black and solid, rising from the ridge as it always had. But in the way it breathed, in the way light moved through it differently now that the shutters weren't always half closed, in the way the servants walked the corridors with slightly straighter backs, Mabel Doolin was the head of household staff now, to be elevated by formal appointment, the new position carrying both respect and actual authority. Because Ava had pointed out to Darian one evening over the strategy table that the castle's existing servants knew more about its operational weaknesses than any outside advisor, and that the best thing he could do was make it worth their loyalty to report up rather than to ignore down. He had listened. He usually listened now in the way he had always listened, carefully, completely, with the full weight of his attention. But now to a voice that answered him back in real time, in full sentences, with opinions that did not always agree with his. He had seemed, the first time she openly disagreed with him, to not know what to do with it. Then he had smiled. It was a real smile, not the almost smile she had catalogued from across the study. A full, quiet, private smile that lived at the corners of his mouth and made something happen behind his eyes. She had added it to her catalogue. She had a very large catalogue of him by now. The archer from the assembly had been Wesley Cantrell's hired man, and Wesley Cantrell was no longer in a position to hire men for anything, removed from his seat on the regional council, his assets under formal audit, his brother Gerald currently being asked a great many questions he was finding difficult to answer satisfactorily. Bruce Lambert had quietly distanced himself from both Cantrells within a week of the assembly, which said everything necessary about where his real loyalties had always lived. Leona Brock remained complicated, but complication was manageable when you knew the shape of it. That Clara Richmond had taken a particular interest in Ava that was partly professional. Clara had spent 30 years reading people for a living and found Ava's precision genuinely remarkable. And partly the specific warmth of an older woman recognizing something in a younger one. Kerry Hampton had been promoted to personal assistant to the household secretary, which put her closer to her brother's situation and gave her a formal channel through which to work on it. Pamela Mackenzie had softened slowly, the way old stone softens at the edges when enough water has passed over it. Not changed, but rounded. And Ava. Ava stood at the window of what had been designated her study, her own room, proper, with a desk and a lamp and shelves that were accumulating books at a rate that suggested she was making up for lost time, and looked out over the courtyard below. The trees were beginning to turn, yellow and amber at the edges, still green at the centre, the season shifting in the way seasons shifted here, slowly and then all at once. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't delay her reaction anymore. She turned, and Darian was in the doorway. Not the formal doorway of his study, but hers, which he entered with permission now, which was a thing she had asked for early on, and which he had given without argument, because he understood, in the specific way he understood most things about her. What it meant to have a space that was entirely one's own. He leaned against the doorframe, looked at her. "Finch wants a response drafted for the Brock petition," he said. "I read it," she said. "My response is that the petition has 3 different objectives buried in one document, and that Leona Brock is hoping you'll focus on the surface one and miss the other 2, which are access to the garrison records from the previous decade, and a formal meeting with whoever controls the Northern Passage agreements." He was quiet for a moment. "Write that up," he said. "Already did." She gestured at the desk. He crossed the room, picked up the parchment, read it. She watched him read it. The particular quality of his focus when he was absorbing information, the way his eyes moved efficiently, and his face stayed neutral until something landed that he hadn't anticipated, at which point the left side of his jaw moved slightly. The left side of his jaw moved. "This is," he said. "Very good." "I know," she said. He looked up. She smiled. He set the parchment down, crossed the remaining distance between them with the deliberateness that was entirely his, never rushing, never careless, Everything he did shaped by the understanding that how you moved toward someone mattered as much as whether you moved at all. He tilted her chin up lightly with 2 fingers. You, he said, were the worst decision I ever made by conventional standards. I know, she said again, soft, and the best decision I ever made by every other measure. She looked at him. She had spent most of her life listening to what people didn't say, because what they said was rarely the truth. She had learned to read the space around words, the weight of silence, the things that lived in pauses and glances, and the precise quality of a person's stillness. She didn't need any of those skills with him. He said what he meant. He had always said what he meant, when he thought no one who mattered was listening. She was listening. She had always been listening. I know, she said, for the 3rd time, and his mouth curved, and she reached up and pressed her hand flat against his chest, above his heart, where she could feel it, steady and present, and hers. He covered her hand with his. Outside, the courtyard trees continued their slow turn. The season moved. The castle breathed. Somewhere in Ashford Market, a marketplace cobblestone bore the faint mark where a basket had been set down carefully by a girl who had been sold for 1 silver coin on a rainy morning and decided, out in the quiet dignity of her own despair, not to give anyone the gift of her falling apart. She hadn't fallen apart. She had come apart. The old version, the hidden version, the version that had learned to keep herself so small and so silent that the world could forget to count her. And she had been rebuilt into something truer, not by rescue, by being seen. There is a particular, irreplaceable thing that happens when someone looks at you, not at the useful version of you, not at the convenient version, not at the label you've been wearing since childhood, but at you, the real interior you, the version that has been listening and thinking and surviving underneath all the silence. When that happens, something in you knows it, and something in you, for the first time, breathes. Some stories begin in betrayal. Some begin in silence, or some begin with a girl standing in cold rain with a basket of linens and a mother who has just named her price. But the rarest stories, the ones worth telling across distance, the ones that stay, begin in the moment someone looks at what the world has discarded and says, "No, I see what this is, and it is not nothing." Ava Hendricks was sold for 1 silver coin on a Tuesday morning in the rain. She became the only voice the Alpha King ever truly listened to. And her silence, that long, careful, exhausting, magnificent silence, was never weakness. It was the armor she wore until she found someone worth taking it off for. Where broken heroines rise, silent strength becomes power, and love listens deeper than words ever could.